He had built his empire on fear, not love. Everyone in his world knew that when he spoke, people obeyed when he entered a room. Silence followed. Nothing in his life ever slipped out of his control until he married her. A quiet woman with serene eyes who never spoke a single word. The doctor said an accident years ago had stolen her voice, leaving her mute. He agreed to the marriage only because family ties demanded it, and she seemed too fragile to matter to him. At first, he treated her like expensive furniture, something that belonged in his home but never in his life. She moved through his mansion softly, her steps like whispers, obeying every unspoken rule, meeting his eyes only when necessary. It unsettled him, that calm she carried. He mistook gentleness for weakness and patience for emptiness. It began as a test, nothing more. One night, he decided to see what it would take to crack that calm exterior. A business associate had once told him that fear either exposes loyalty or reveals defiance, so he brought a snake from one of his private breeding projects, a harmless one but large, enough to terrify most people. When she was asleep, he carefully released it near the foot of the bed, its smooth body sliding across the sheets. He expected her to wake up screaming, running, anything that would break her stillness. Instead, she stirred gently, eyes opening in the dim light, her gaze falling on the reptile moving beside her. He stood in the corner of the room, watching quietly, waiting for panic. But what happened next made him frown in disbelief. She didn't recoil. She sat up slowly and reached out, her fingertips brushing the snake's back with deliberate care. It lifted its head slightly, tongue flicking the air, and she smiled, soft, patient, unafraid. She disappeared for a moment, returning with a small dish of milk, kneeling as she placed it on the floor. The snake slithered toward it, coiling neatly. She stayed beside it, stroking its scaled skin until it drank. The sight left him speechless. The woman he had thought silent, because of fear, was showing a quiet compassion that felt foreign inside his ruthless world. She looked up suddenly, directly into his eyes in the dark corner. Her expression was calm but knowing. For the first time, he realized she had known he was there all along. Without a word, she lifted the snake gently, walked across the floor and placed it into his hands. Her eyes told him more than her silence ever had. "You can test me, but you can't shake me." That calm disarmed him completely. For a man used to commanding power, he'd just discovered something stronger, someone who didn't need words to hold it. The next morning, sunlight poured through the sheer curtains, spreading a golden haze across the room. He hadn't slept. He sat at the edge of the bed, the snake safely back in its terrarium, watching his wife move quietly through her morning routine as if nothing had happened. Washing her face, combing her hair, dressing with delicate precision. Not once did she glance his way, not even when their eyes met briefly in the mirror. She wasn't avoiding him. She simply didn't acknowledge what he had done. That silence throttled his mind more than if she'd shouted at him. He wanted to see some kind of reaction, anger, confusion, fear, but there was none. She acted like she had fed a hungry guest rather than faced, down a test meant to scare her. Breakfast was served downstairs. She took her usual seat at the end of the long table, the porcelain cup sitting in her hands. The maids glanced nervously between them, sensing the strange tension. He never mentioned the night. When he looked at her over the rim of his coffee mug, she smiled faintly, polite as ever. Before taking another sip of tea, it bothered him that she seemed untouched by what he'd done. He told himself that it was curiosity now, pure curiosity, that made him study her. The way her eyes followed sunlight through the window, the steady rhythm of her breathing when she read, how she signed to the staff with gentle gestures that spoke louder than any voice could. Later that day, when he returned from work, he found her outside, in the garden, kneeling by the flower beds. The same snake from the night before was curled lazily near her feet, half in the shade. She glanced up at him as if expecting his arrival, her fingers stroking the reptile's back like a companion. Something twisted in his chest, strange and unfamiliar. She wasn't afraid of anything that belonged to him. Not his money, not his temper, not even his tricks. When she stood, she turned to face him, lifted her hands, and signed a small phrase the staff had taught him months ago. The sign meant "thank you for bringing it back." He froze. She thought he'd let the snake free to keep her company. He nodded once without correcting her. That evening, as he poured himself a drink, he realized he wasn't thinking about business meetings or profits, but about the look in her eyes when she faced him, calm and unyielding, like quiet water that wears away stone. It was the first time in years he didn't understand the game he had started, and for the first time he didn't want to end it. Days drifted by and nothing about her changed. She moved around their house like a quiet rhythm the walls had learned to expect, watering plants, checking on staff, writing small notes that replaced the voice she didn't have. He began to notice details he'd overlooked before. How she never wasted movements. How she listened more than anyone he knew. How the silence around her wasn't emptiness, but time she gave to others to feel seen. He kept testing her without meaning to. When his temper flared in a meeting, he'd return expecting her to flinch at the echo of anger in his breath. Yet she'd only tilt her head slightly and pour him tea. If storms kept him awake, she left the lamp, lit near his chair and the window, cracked just enough to let the rain's rhythm settle him back down. He realized he had started waiting for those small things. One afternoon he came home unexpectedly and heard music, soft piano drifting from the far wing of the house. Following the sound, he found her sitting before an old upright piano, eyes closed, hands hesitant but graceful. Every note was uneven, a little broken, yet filled with some emotion he didn't know how to name. She turned when she felt his presence, but didn't stop playing. He leaned against the doorway, saying nothing until the last note faded. She smiled and pressed her fingers to her chest. A gesture that he understood meant this makes peace. He wanted to speak, but the words caught somewhere inside him. For years, his world had been measured by silence used as punishment, cold and heavy. For the first time, silence felt alive, something shared rather than endured. That night over dinner, he found himself asking the maid to teach him simple signs. Please. Thank you. Good. Beautiful. He spent hours practicing when no one saw him, determined to speak her language. 2 nights later, he used them without warning. When she placed a small dish in front of him, he signed clumsy but deliberate movements. Thank you. You cooked this. It's good. She stilled, eyes wide, then laughed, a sound airy and light that startled him. It wasn't loud, just a whisper of laughter pressed through breath. The closest thing to a voice he'd heard from her. The sound made his heart stutter. In that single moment, he understood something had shifted permanently between them. What began as curiosity had turned into something deeper, a quiet pull he couldn't explain and no longer wanted to resist. By the end of that month, the house felt different. The air didn't carry the same cold echo it once did. He woke earlier now, not because of alarms or schedules, but because he liked hearing the faint rustle of her in the kitchen. She'd hum without sound, a rhythm made by the soft tap of cups and plates. He began joining her, standing across the counter just watching. Sometimes she'd glance up and give him that small smile, the one that reached her eyes. For a man who once built walls out of habit, he found himself dismantling them without noticing. He no longer believed silence had to mean distance. In her stillness, he found patience he didn't know he needed. One evening after a long business trip, he returned exhausted, to find the garden light still on. She was waiting on the patio. The snake curled nearby like it belonged there as much as the roses. He sat opposite her, the air cool and sweet with night-blooming jasmine. She set a cup of tea in front of him and signed slowly with her elegant hands. Everything all right? He nodded. Then, haltingly, he signed back, missed you. She laughed again, that soft, quiet sound that had become his favorite. He reached across the table, his hand covering hers. For a long time, he just looked at her face. The calm expression that had once made him. Restless, now grounding. Him in a way nothing else ever had. He said quietly that the first night he met her, he'd mistaken stillness for fear. Thought silence meant weakness. She shook her head and picked up his hand. Signing against his palm, silence is strength too. He held her eyes as he whispered, I know that now. The snake shifted beside them and she smiled at the movement, then reached down and lifted it easily in her hands. It coiled around her arm, sleepy and harmless. Watching her, he finally understood why nothing had frightened her that night. She simply refused to meet the world with cruelty, only calm. That kind of courage wasn't loud, but it changed everything it touched. Later, when she leaned against him, resting her head on his shoulder, He realized he hadn't meant for the marriage to be more than a convenience. Yet here he was, heart unguarded, feeling more at peace than he ever had. The cold CEO, everyone whispered, about had met someone whose silence thawed him completely. Not with words, not with gestures of wealth, but with kindness so consistent it became impossible to ignore. He'd set a test meant to frighten her and ended up learning what devotion looked like. For the first time in his life, he didn't want control. He only wanted the quiet warmth of the woman who had fed what others would fear and taught him something new about love.